This audio is brought to you by Muslim Central. Please consider donating to help cover our running costs and future projects by visiting www.muslimcentral.com/donate.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
In the name of God, the Beneficent, the Merciful, the Creator and Sustainer of the universe, peace and blessings upon His servant and messenger Muhammad forever. Ameen. I greet you with a greeting that is common in Islam, Assalamu alaikum, which means peace be unto you. I'm your host, Hamid Rashid. Today we have our 45th program in our series dealing with the social system of Islam. We'll be continuing our discussion of dissolution of marriage in Islam. I have joining me on the program, as usual, Dr. Jamal Badawi of St. Mary's University. Brother Jamal, Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Could I have you very quickly summarize the main points that we touched on in our program last week?
Okay, the main issue that was raised really is that divorce in Islam is not as easy as some people may think of it, and that there are certain preventative measures before divorce even take place, like careful selection of the spouses, trying to live by the Islamic law in one's relationship to his or her spouse. Secondly, there are certain measures also in case there is a family dispute to try to contain it and have certain measures between husband and wife, if not perhaps involving some relatives in a kind of arbitration. But in no case should swearing or cruelty could be resorted to. And we indicated that all of these measures, preventative or otherwise, do not prejudice the right of the woman to seek divorce if there is a good reason behind.
Well, you made some mention of the wife seeking or initiating divorce. I think the common notion about Islam is that divorce in Islam is always the exclusive right of the husband. Could you perhaps comment and clarify that?
It's common but not necessarily true. In fact, this is one of 4 forms of dissolution of marriage in Islam. In fact, if you look at it in terms of the tradition or most common, yes, most cases the husband divorced the wife unilaterally, but this is one. There are cases also in Islamic law where the wife unilaterally can divorce her husband. Thirdly, there are cases also where the wife can initiate and obtain divorce through an Islamic court. And fourthly, there are cases also where divorce could be obtained by mutual agreement between the two spouses. So to say it's only the exclusive right of the husband is a common mistaken notion. The principle of the right to seek an end to unhappy and unsuccessful marriage is established, and it applies both to husband and wife, even though procedures and particulars might vary.
Under what conditions may the wife be able to unilaterally divorce her husband?
Well, there are 2 basic cases where the wife can unilaterally use that right. One can be called delegated repudiation. The Islamic term for that is asma, that if the wife at the time of marriage or afterwards agree with the husband that there will be a transfer of the right to divorce to her, then if and when she desires, she can divorce her husband unilaterally, but it has to be part of the nuptial contract. That's one. The second case can be called conditional repudiation, which means that at the time of negotiating the marriage contract, the wife could stipulate that the husband should be obliged to fulfill X, Y, Z duties, or that if the husband commit A, B, C type of acts against her, let's say cruelty or mistreatment, then she would have the right also to divorce him, because as we indicated in a previous program, marriage contract also is both a religious as well as a civil contract, where conditions which are not contrary to Islamic law must be implemented and enforced. There may be difference between Muslim jurists about the nature and the specific format of these 2 types, but there is basis for this unilateral divorce even by the wife.
Well, you also mentioned that a Muslim wife may seek divorce through the judicial process.
That's right.
What are some of the acceptable grounds to seek such a divorce?
There are several grounds. Let me give 7 as example to show the spirit of Islamic law on this. First is the inability or refusal of the husband to provide for his wife, even if his wife is rich. Because in Islam, it is the full responsibility of the husband to maintain his wife. And this is the opinion of the majority of jurists, including such towering figures as Malik, Shafi'i, and Ahmad. Some, like Hanafi, said that if it's just a matter of temporary poverty, or if the person does not have that much and still able to maintain to the best of his ability, the marriage cannot be dissolved. A second basis or ground is abuse or mistreatment, such as, for example, cruel or severe beating or so-called wife battering that you hear about in the media, to which 10% of women in North America seem to be subjected to. This is totally forbidden in Islam, this severe type of chastisement. Likewise, cursing or swearing at one's wife, forcing her to do something which is wrong from an Islamic point of view. This could constitute a base for divorce. A third case could be the case of impotence on the part of the husband, and this is in recognition in Islam of the natural instinctive right of the wife, just as it is recognized for the husband too. A fourth ground could be the serious or incurable diseases, which I'm not talking here about the flu or something,
yes,
but serious repulsive type of diseases or insanity. If a person becomes insane, for example, why should the wife be stuck with him for the rest of her life? If she chooses, of course, there's no objection, but she has the right. Fifthly, extended absence or desertion by the husband. And there could be 2 cases there. The case where the whereabouts of the deserted husband is, or the husband who deserted his wife is known, in which case a Muslim judge can give him a certain appointed time to come back to his wife, or else he can grant her divorce, yes, if she wishes. Or if the husband who deserted his wife is not known, his whereabouts are not clear, the judge also can give a certain waiting period and divorce the wife if she wishes after that. Some say that 6 months would be enough waiting period, like in Malik. Some say 1 year, like in Ahmad. But in each case, whatever the case, she has the right also to obtain divorce. Sixthly, by analogy to the previous case, the long imprisonment of the husband, because it's just similar to desertion really, whether it's interpreted as divorce like Malik suggests, or annulment like Ahmad suggests, she has the right to get out of it. Finally, there are also all cases of annulment, such as deception at the time of marriage by giving false information or concealing important information, in which case a wife still is entitled to seek divorce.
How about the situations of divorce by mutual consent of both sides? When is this applicable?
There are 2 basic cases for that. One is known as mubara'ah, or mutually agreeing between themselves to release each other from the vow of marriage, mutual agreement, in which case they can agree among themselves as to what are the conditions, financial or otherwise, for the settlement. This could be done. Second case is the case of khul'a. Some translate that as self-redemption. This would be the case of the wife who might be unhappy with her husband, but she cannot really fault him in any legal sense, that is, his fulfilling his duties and responsibilities. And she fears that if this relationship continues, she may be tempted to fall into some error. In which case, the rule in Islamic law is that they could agree among themselves that she can return back to him any financial privilege that she obtained from him by way of gifts, marital gifts, for example, or whatever he gave to her in return for obtaining the solution for the marriage. There is a reference, by the way, in the Quran to this particular form, or khula, in chapter 2, verse 229. But there are a few observations about that form. One is that a wife should not ask for this self-redemption or khula, unless there is a good reason in her, at least best appreciation or understanding. Because as the Prophet indicated in Ahmad and An-Nasa'i, it is not proper for a woman to seek this kind of dissolution if there is no good reason behind it. Secondly, even if the husband refuses dissolution, it must be imposed on him. In fact, there is a story at the time of the Prophet, as narrated in Bukhari and An-Nasa'i. A man by the name of Thabit ibn Qais and his wife again wanted to use that right, and he loved her, he didn't want to, but the Prophet instructed him, خُذِ الْحَدِيقَةَ وَطَلِّقْهَا تَطْلِيقًا, because he gave her an orchard and she offered to return it back. He said, all right, take the garden or the orchard from her and divorce her. She wanted. You don't have to force it. A third observation is that a man in Islam, or the husband, is prohibited from trying to oppress or pressure his wife so that she offers to return this marital gifts to him in order to get out of the marital relationship. That's not regarded as fair. And in chapter 4 verse 19 in the Quran there is mention of that. The other observation also, which is more technical in nature, is that in this particular type of dissolution of marriage, it could take place at any time.
Well, now the procedures that you've outlined seem to be quite fair, but some people have raised the argument, why can't the wife have the absolute right of divorce in any case?
Unilateral, under any circumstances?
Under any circumstances.
Well, I think we have to distinguish here between two things. One is the principle established in Islamic law for the right of either husband or wife to seek an end to a miserable or difficult, unsuccessful type of marriage, and that right is for both. And between the specific procedures and the initiation of the process. First of all, to say that the wife should have exactly the same right without any reason to divorce her husband unilaterally, except for the cases, of course, that were outlined previously, might not be to the best interest of the family or even the wife herself. Aside from the fact that this reduces the opportunity or the chances for dissolution of marriage, at least 4 points should be remembered. First of all, the purpose of marriage in Islam is continuation, is permanency, and not just divorce or dissolution. And if this is the case, we may remark that while man or the husband is capable of being sometimes emotional or taking a compulsive decision that's not well thought of and divorce his wife, however, it is fair to say that a woman, on the average, in comparative terms, seem to be relatively more emotional than man. And this is not a deficiency. In fact, this is part of her function as a wife, and more importantly as a mother. That's not a deficiency to be emotional. But the danger also of that emotionality, if the wife can divorce at the spur of the moment without any waiting or procedure or certain restriction, that she may destroy her family and future and then regret it when it's too late to make correction. Secondly is that while there is no winner really in the case of divorce, everybody loses, at least psychologically, in the short run, and perhaps even longer than that. But still, the man in Islam, in Islamic law, or the husband, stands to lose much more in the case of divorce. Why? Because if he divorces, then the wife would be entitled for the entire marital gift, whether the part that she received already or the part that is due to her. It becomes due immediately. She is entitled to full maintenance during the waiting period, which could go to 3 months, could go in some cases, like in pregnancy, to even 9 months. Thirdly, she would be entitled to child support if she has the custody of the child, which is usually the case when the child is small. Fourthly, according to some jurists, she is also entitled to another consolation type of payment as a result of divorce. Some extend it as 1 year type of maintenance, or to complete 1 year at the expense of the husband. If you look at it the other way around, you find that the wife does not suffer financial losses as a result of divorce. Her property before marriage remain intact and does not transfer to her husband whether she is married or divorced. Anything that she earns on her property during marital life, she is not responsible to pay a penny to her husband or spend on household. So this really shows that in the case of divorce, it is man really who stands to lose a lot more financially, at least in the context of Islamic law. And this may act as a natural deterrent on the husband taking a compulsive action towards divorce. He stands to lose a great deal, more than the wife does. And on the other hand, it would be unfair for, with all the financial securities and privileges given to the wife but not to the husband in Islamic law, that she can at any time divorce her husband and still keep all the gifts and property that he has given to her, whether or not she has a good reason for divorce. In fact, a third point perhaps could be raised here, that if Islamic law did not provide some control on this, any unscrupulous woman could get married and divorced so many times as she wishes, and every time she gets the marital gift, which could be substantial, she get all the expenditure, she doesn't have to spend a penny, and just keep doing that and perhaps exploit also. Islam and Islamic law does not only protect the wife, it also protects the husband. I mean, he's entitled also to some protection against possible exploitation like this. The fourth point is that with all of these controls, even as indicated before, if the woman has a genuine reason to ask for divorce, the avenues are open in the variety of ways that has been already been described.
Well, for many people who are not familiar with the Islamic system of law, it's surprising that in some circumstances parties may be able to obtain a divorce without resort to the legal process. Mm-hmm. They ask the question, well, why aren't both sides required to seek divorce only through a court of law?
You mean no unilateral by either side, or even excluding agreements between? Right. Well, first of all, if there is an agreement between both sides, and they find that this is mutually beneficial to them, like the various cases we described, mubara'a or khula, the various techniques, why should the court impose their will on them? Okay, that's one. I'm not saying that society has nothing to say, but there are cases where it's mutually advantageous for both of them. But more importantly, I think, is that to have divorce through courts result in lots of delays, as any judge, family judge can tell, the delays and waiting long time. And during this period, a wife is prohibited from remarrying, and sometimes it takes years in litigation. Secondly, to go to court in a family problem without really a strong justification generates a situation where every side would have to justify to the judge that his or her spouse is at fault, and trying to reveal all kind of weaknesses, rightly or wrongly, which of course is not a very pleasant situation. In fact, this bitterness resulting from legal litigation, if they were permitted in a widespread manner, could destroy any opportunity for future reconciliation. Mm-hmm. Another reason is that divorce and marriage is something that is very personal. There could be very personal and private reason for a man or woman to seek a divorce. And these psychological reasons for people who are not uninvolved directly in the marital relationship might be very difficult to appreciate and evaluate. There are cases, of course, however, where injustice could be inflicted unless the law or the court of law, Islamic court of law, can step in which case we said that there's the door open. But Islam does not encourage having every case just being presented before a court of law. And we have seen in a previous program that in some cases family arbitration could solve the problem. Even private arrangement between husband and wife to agree on certain arrangement might save the marriage without undue interference on the part of others. But mind you, even in the case where the husband uses the unilateral right to divorce his wife, it is not just something that takes place on the spur of the moment like that. There are certain restrictions and controls also, conditions to be valid.
Well, could we perhaps have you comment on some of these conditions that are necessary for the validity of divorce?
Okay, for divorce to be valid, the husband uttering the divorce must be sane, must be conscious, under no compulsion, so not that his father say you have to divorce your wife or something, no compulsion, and he should really mean fully what he says when he utters divorce. A second condition is that the word used for divorce should be clear and unequivocal in terms, the term should be unequivocal. Whether the divorce is, or the word is direct or indirect, in writing or orally, in person or through a messenger, it has to be clear and unequivocal. A third condition is that a person cannot divorce his wife at any time. There are certain restrictions and certain periods where divorce is forbidden. And fourthly, it should be noted that the first three conditions automatically eliminates from validity of divorce the case of a person who is under the influence of drug or alcohol, a person who is intoxicated, which is prohibited in Islam in any way. But if that happens and he divorces, that's not regarded as valid. Secondly, it also excludes people who utter divorce unseriously, just like in some cultures a person say, oh, you must be my guest or else I'll divorce my wife, you must do this or that or else I'll divorce my wife. This is regarded as lagh, or just vain talk, which is not to be taken seriously. And some jurists said that the atonement for uttering this would be to feed 10 poor people or to fast 3 days to atone for it, but divorce will not take place. And this also eliminates or excludes the case of divorce under certain types or states of anger, where the person does not appreciate what he says.
Well, now that is an interesting area, because almost any divorce is going to involve some level of anger and upset. How can you distinguish between the various states of anger which may result in a validation or invalidity of a divorce?
Well, a very nice subdivision was suggested by one of the great jurists, Ibn al-Qayyim, and he said there are 3 possible cases or degrees of anger. I know the lines might be hazy, but he said there is the case of anger which is very extreme, to the point that the person does not really want to say what he's saying, does not appreciate or understand even what he's uttering. Extreme case. And he said that the consensus of Muslim jurists is that this type of divorce is invalid, because it is just analogous to a person who is really out of his mind. So it does not result in automatic dissolution of the family. The second case is the case of moderate degree of anger. And of course nobody divorces unless there is some anger, you're right. But there is a type of anger where the person fully understands what he says, has the premeditated intention to end the marital relationship. And again, Ibn al-Qayyim said that the consensus among Muslim jurists that this is a valid divorce. There's no problem with this. But the one that is rather controversial is what might be called a medium degree of anger, where the person is not totally out of his mind, but he utters divorce without appreciating the consequences of this uttering or utterance. And as soon as he utters divorce, he started again regretting, or shortly afterwards he started regretting and wondering why did I do such bad thing. And this the jurists differed. Some said the divorce is valid, some said it is invalid. The opinion that seems to be more consistent with various facets of Islamic law is that it does not validate the marriage. In other words, marriage under this moderate or medium degree of anger should not take place.
Divorce, you mean?
Pardon me?
Divorce should not take place.
Oh, sorry, divorce should not take place. And there are a number of reasons behind giving more credence or weighing more weight to this interpretation. First is that there are several sayings of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Some are narrated, for example, in Ahmad, Abu Dawood, and Hakim, and Ibn Majah, in which the Prophet said that there is no divorce or freedom in the case of ighlaq, and ighlaq was interpreted by Abu Dawood to mean the case where the person is under strong state of anger. In fact, in another saying of the Prophet narrated in Bukhari, he said إنما الطلاق عن وتر, that is, divorce is only when there is deliberate intention. It's not just something casual or out of the spur of the moment or outburst of emotions. Secondly, in the Quran, a principle is established in the case of oath, for example, which could be analogous. And in chapter 2, verse 225, it says, لا يؤاخذكم الله باللغو في أيمانكم. God does not hold you responsible for something you utter just out of, laghu, not really with clear intention or deliberate intention. A third point is that under medium degree of anger, where the person does not appreciate the consequences of utterance like this, he may be somewhat analogous to a person who is under intoxication, which we indicated would invalidate the pronouncement of divorce. And finally, the lack of acceptance of this as a base or a basis for divorce seems to be consistent with the main purpose of Islamic law, and that is to protect the family and maintain its integrity as much as it is realistic and possible to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned a bit earlier that there are specific times when divorce is not permissible. Could I have you comment and clarify what those times are?
Well, first of all, a husband cannot divorce his wife when she is during her monthly cycle. Secondly, except of course in the case of khula or self-redemption that we talked about before, which we said it could take place anytime, but other than that, he cannot divorce at the time of at the time of haid or menses. Secondly, even if the wife is not going through her monthly cycle, which is the case which is called, according to one writer, fresh purity, that's after the cycle is finished, he cannot also divorce her during this period if intimate matrimonial relationship took place. So that period also would be excluded. He has to wait until the following cycle, and then after the cycle is over, then he can pronounce divorce. Thirdly, a husband in Islam cannot divorce his wife during the postnatal recovery period after childbirth. Divorce under these circumstances or these particular periods is regarded as contra sunnah divorce or bid'i, which means divorce which is contrary to the path of the Prophet or contrary to the Islamic law. Some jurists go to the point of saying that it is invalid and the husband would be required to repeal it and then pronounce it or utter it in the permissible times. So these are the times where divorce could not be regarded as legitimate. But of course, if divorce has taken place and if the required waiting period has elapsed, a husband has no right to keep his wife or force her to stay without releasing her, like the Quran indicates in chapter 2 in verse 230, that you should not hold your wife just for the purpose of hurting her or oppressing her or pressuring her once the various requirements and waiting period has already elapsed.
Mm-hmm. But we'll end it at that for today. We want to thank you for watching our program and invite you back next week. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be unto you.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
This audio is brought to you by Muslim Central. Please consider donating to help cover our running costs and future projects by visiting www.muslimcentral.com/donate.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. La ilaha illallah.
In the name of God, the Beneficent, the Merciful, the Creator and the Sustainer of the universe, peace and blessings upon His servant and messenger Muhammad forever. Ameen. I greet you with a greeting that is common in Islam. Assalamu alaikum, which means peace be unto you. I'm your host, Hamid Rashid. Today we have our 46th and concluding program in this series dealing with the social system of Islam. Today we'll be concluding our discussion of dissolution of marriage. I have joining me on the program as usual Dr. Jamal Badawi of Sheikh Marriage University. Brother Jamal, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Could I ask you to summarize and highlight the main points we touched on in our last program?
Certainly. First of all, it was emphasized that the right to seek dissolution or divorce for some unsuccessful and unhappy marriage is a principle which applies in Islam to both wife and husband, and it's not like some people think it's the exclusive right of the husband in all cases. We talked about the 4 different cases. Secondly, we said that within this broad principle, the mechanism and procedure of divorce may vary in the case of husband than the wife. It might be similar in some cases, but it need not necessarily be identical, and we described some of the reasons for these variations, and that it basically relates to the question of equity. Thirdly, we started discussion of the conditions, or some of the main conditions and restrictions that Islam imposes on the process of divorce, some of which related to anger, divorce under the state of anger, and to what extent can that be effective or valid, and also about the prohibition of divorce during certain periods, such as during the monthly cycle of the wife, she could not be divorced, during the postnatal confinement after childbirth, which could extend to 40 days as a maximum, or even divorcing a wife during the so-called fresh purity, that is after even the end of the feminine cycle, if intimate relationship has taken place during this fresher purity.
Well, maybe we could begin today's program with some discussion as to why divorce is prohibited during these times that you've just referred to.
Well, first of all, prohibition of divorce during the feminine monthly cycle has a very good reason, because during the cycle the woman is likely to be in a state of fatigue, irritation, some degree of tension. It varies, of course, from one person to the other, but there is likely to be this kind of difficulty. And that's why the Quran calls the monthly cycle as adhan, or hurt, something that really bothers. That appears, for example, in chapter 2, in verse 222 in the Quran. Now, mind you, in addition to the irritation and possible tension on the part of the wife, during this cycle in Islam, it is prohibited for the husband to have any matrimonial, intimate relationship with his wife, and that might generate tension on the other side too. Under these circumstances, it is quite possible that misjudgment or haste may take place, and one or the other or both rush into a rash decision to end their marital relationship and destroy the family unit. So in Islamic law, this mandatory requirement that you should not divorce during this period might give some chance to overcome this particular period and just see whether really the two sides, or one or the other, are really serious about divorce. You cannot even utter divorce according to the law. The reason for prohibition of divorce during the period following the childbirth has similar reasons, because also during the recovery period of the mother after childbirth, intimate matrimonial relationship also is not permissible, and a woman has even more need at this time for care, both physically and psychologically, and the last thing really she wants in these circumstances is divorce. So that's why again Islam does not permit divorce during this period, even during the period of pregnancy. So long as the woman is pregnant, the divorce could be uttered, but it cannot become effective until the child is actually is born. The third aspect, that is prohibition of divorce even after the end of the monthly cycle or the period of the so-called fresh purity, if matrimonial relationship, intimate relationship took place. The reason being is that it is quite possible that in this relationship pregnancy occurred. In this case, it would be wise to wait first until we find out whether the wife is actually pregnant or not. And this would be quite important for two reasons. One is to make sure about the lineal identity of the child, who is the father of the child, to make sure. And secondly, that if the husband, let's say planning to divorce his wife, discovers that she is pregnant and gets excited about the birth of a new baby, maybe some change of mind might take place on his part or her part, or both of them, depending on the nature of the dissolution of marriage that we discussed last time. That's why a beautiful reference to that is made in the Quran in chapter 65, in the first verse. It says, لا تدري لعل الله يحدث بعد ذلك أمرا. That is, you should give this waiting period because you don't know, maybe God will bring about a new situation, some new situations, which could possibly mean reconciliation.
Well, now, if all of the conditions that you've just mentioned are observed, does the divorce then become effective immediately?
Not necessarily. Even here, there is a certain waiting period called in Islamic terminology iddah, which is referred to in the chapter I quoted before, chapter 65 in the Quran. This waiting period before, even after uttering the divorce, there must be some waiting period before that utterance become actually effective. That period most commonly is about 3 months. I say most commonly because it's defined in the Quran in chapter 2, verse 228, as ثلاثة قروء, or 3 cycles, whether it's interpreted beginning or ending of monthly feminine cycles. It amounts in most cases to about 3 months waiting period. But this period, however, could be longer, as indicated in the answer to the previous question. If a person divorces his wife while she is pregnant, then the waiting period extends until after she delivers the new baby, which could extend even to close to 9 months. And this is also indicated in the Quran chapter 65 in verse 4. However, that waiting period could conceivably be less than 3 months. For example, if a person divorces his wife during the end of the fresh purity, just 1 day before the new cycle starts, that waiting period could be reduced to close to 2 months, or possibly a little less, depending of course on the natural cycle for every woman, which could be a little different from the others. In some rare cases like khula, or self-redemption that we discussed in a previous program, some jurists like Ibn Abbas and Ahmad and Ibn Taymiyyah, based on a saying of the Prophet narrated in An-Nasa'i, say that the period in the case of self-redemption could be reduced to 1 cycle, or nearly 1 month. Well, this period that I talked about, or waiting periods, presumes that marriage has been consummated. However, If marriage has not been consummated and divorce took place, like a person contracting a marriage, signing the contract, but before consummation, divorce take place. If that is the case, there is no waiting period. The Quran is clear on that. In chapter 33, verse 49 says that if this divorce takes place, then there is no mandatory waiting period. I should add also, maybe I should be frank on this, that in Islamic law, during this waiting period, that is after the utterance of divorce and before it becomes effective,
Yes.
intimate relationship or matrimonial relationship would be forbidden. And if that takes place, it would be tantamount to reconciliation and revocation of the divorce.
Well, now, in those instances where you have a waiting period involved, where would the woman stay, or the wife stay, and who would be responsible for her upkeep and living expenses?
Okay, the answer is quite clear in the Quran on this question. In chapter 65, it makes it clear that a woman, after the utterance of divorce, during this waiting period, is entitled to remain in her own household, as the same as if divorce really didn't take place, in terms of maintenance at least. She would not be, or should not be, according to the verse, be forced out of her house, nor she should even leave, unless of course there is necessity. In other words, she cannot, for example, go and say, all right, I'm going to my daddy's home, and just leave the house like that. Of course she can go out for necessity and come back, but still she is part of the household. As far as the second portion of your question, the responsibility, full responsibility for maintenance during this waiting period falls on the shoulder of the husband, again as if she is still his wife, because technically actually she is his wife. Not only this, in the same chapter 65, it makes it clear that not only is the wife, divorced wife, entitled to this kind of financial support, but she's entitled also to good treatment. Like one verse in the Quran, it's verse 6 in the same chapter, it says that you should provide them housing from your own, according to your own means, that you should not annoy them to restrict them, or in order to restrict them. So she's entitled to both kindness as well as provision. There's a good reason behind that, or good reasons behind. First, the wife during the waiting period would be closer to her husband, and if she's close to him in the same household, this might act as a test of love. And if there is true love between both, and it was just a matter of getting angry against each other, or having a rash decision to divorce, this waiting period could be a chance for reconciliation. Reconciliation could be by stating that that divorce is revoked, you could say it, by a tender touch or a nice word, or as indicated before, if matrimonial intimate relationship take place during the waiting period, it would be regarded legally as revocation of that divorce. So in other words, you don't have to keep them away from each other during this period. If these things happen, revocation take place, then there is no need for having a new marriage contract. They can just revocation without even having a decision by any court, even though some jurists say it is desirable to have witnesses if this revocation takes place. However, one should also add that a wife who is divorced according to this method, and that divorce is revoked during the waiting period, would be deemed as using up, or have used up already, one of those two possible revocable divorces. In other words, even though the husband may get back to his wife during the waiting period, he would be deemed as using one of the two permissible revocable divorces. Another possible reason for this waiting period is again to make sure whether the wife is pregnant or not, so that establishes the lineage of the child. A third possible reason perhaps can be added here, is that even after the waiting period, if both parties are determined to end their marital relationship, the waiting period can serve as a transitional period in which both sides get ready and get adjusted to the kind of situation that they're bound to face after their marriage is ended. As I indicated earlier, and this is an important technical point, that during the waiting period, the wife technically is regarded as still a wife. In fact, jurists say that if the husband, for example, dies, or the wife dies during this waiting period, they will be treated as husband and wife in terms of law of inheritance.
Well, now, what is the Islamic position from the point of view of Islamic law in terms of after a wife has been divorced concerning remarriage? Is it permissible, or is it considered to be a sin?
No, it's not regarded as a sin in Islam to remarry, because divorce cannot be presumed automatically to be her own error. It could be as a result of her own fault, the fault of her husband, the fault of both of them, or no fault of both of them. It could be simply a case of mismatch. And that's why, for example, the Quran in chapter 4, verse 30, it says, وَإِن يَتَفَرَّقَا يُغْنِ اللَّهُ كُلًّا مِنْ سَعَتِهِ, that if divorce really takes place and they separate from each other, maybe God will provide each of them from His bounty, i.e. maybe they might both start a new life with a new spouse and still have a happy marital life. But even if you assume that the divorce was mainly because of her own fault, the Islamic attitude towards that is that she should be given another chance. We all make mistakes and fall in lots of these faults, so another chance should be given. And let's remember also that as indicated in some previous programs, marriage is very much encouraged in Islam. Islam does not encourage people to remain unmarried for the rest of their lives. What happened to a wife who was divorced while she was 22 years old? Why she should be condemned to live as a single person for the rest of her life, even though it may not even be her fault? For that reason, in Islam, there is no stigma attached to the question of remarriage. Mind you, there may be some cultures, Muslim or non-Muslim, which regard with suspicion and stigmatize a divorced wife or divorced husband, for that matter. But this has nothing to do with the teaching of Islam. Islam looks at it as a very simple matter, of probably mismatch, and without implying that remarriage is sinful in itself. Perhaps, if I may add two more observations that relate to this particular question. First is that remarriage is not only permissible with another person, that is, to get married to another person other than the ex-husband, but it could also be permissible in the case of the same husband, the ex-husband. In other words, the wife, after the elapse of the waiting period, where there is no conciliation, and that's the first divorce, let's say, became effective, she would be permitted, in fact, to remarry to the same husband for the second and even third and final time. The other observation is that not only remarriage is permissible in the case of divorce or annulment, but the Quran also, according to chapter 2, particularly verse 232, prohibits anyone to try to forbid or prevent the wife or the woman from reconciling to her ex-husband. Well, of course, within the permissible limits. That's second or maximum third time. That one should not stop her if they decide to get back together and try a new life again. But in any case, as I indicated earlier, if divorce takes place and the waiting period has already elapsed and they want to reconcile, it must be with a new contract, a new marital gift given to the wife, and possibly even new conditions if they wish to be added to their contract.
Well, I'm curious to have you comment on the situation where you have a woman who's divorced from the same husband for the third time. I gather from what you've said there can be no reconciliation after that.
That's correct. You see, if divorce has already taken place twice before between the same husband and wife,
Yes.
and after each of these divorces there was reconciliation, so there was divorce, reconciliation, second divorce, reconciliation, and then divorce takes place still for the third time, then this is an evidence of one of two things. Either that there is a serious problem, a lack of matchability or reconcilability between husband and wife, or that one of them or both is not too serious and does not have enough respect for marital relationship and take it too lightly, in which case some stop, or you have to put your foot down, put some stop to that. So whatever reason might be there behind it, restoration of the solemnity and respect for marriage is needed, and that's why in Islamic law, if a person divorces the same wife for the third time after all these procedures, it becomes irrevocable divorce. There is only one rare case, very rare case, where they may get back together after the third divorce, and that is specified also in the Quran, that if after the third divorce that wife get married to another person for the purpose of permanence, not just to go around the law, for the purpose of permanence, and it so happened without any deliberate premeditated intention that other husband, second husband, divorced her or died, let's say, maybe in that case she can come back and she would be entitled to remarry her ex-husband. But Islam again made it clear that it should never be done just for the purpose of the so-called tahleel, in this non-permissible way, that you should not just make a kind of formal contract just for the purpose of letting the wife come back to her husband without really having a real intention on both sides to live permanently. So of course if you follow the Islamic law in that, it would be a very, very rare case. It's just the probability would be very, very small. There is one case that should also be mentioned there, that if the husband divorces his wife, let's say 3 times in the same breath, like say, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, the question was raised as to whether this would make it irrevocable, that this is final because he said it already 3 times, or whether it should be counted as 1 time. There was a weak interpretation. Actually, it was a personal interpretation of one of the great caliphs after the Prophet, Umar, to punish people who used to use that frequently. He said, all right, if you say it 3 times, it would be irrevocable. But many other jurists, like Ibn al-Qayyim and others, did not agree with him, and they refer to a variety of saying of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as narrated in Ahmad, for example, and Abu Dawood, of a man who divorced his wife 3 times in the same breath, in the same setting. And he came to the Prophet and said, I love her, could I, revoke that? He said, did you say it all in the same time? He said, yes. He said, you could return back to her if you wish. So they conclude from that even if you say it 100 times in the same breath or the same occasion, it still would be counted 1. And I think that makes sense, because the purpose of Islamic law is to provide opportunity for reconciliation. And even some jurists like Abu Hanifa, they say that there should be about 1 month period between each divorce. In other words, a person can divorce his wife and return her. If he divorces her, he has to wait again, allow for some time, not just reconcile and next day divorce again. So the wisdom of legislation in Islam here is to give a chance for reconciliation, if it's possible at all.
How about the financial matters and the questions of custody after divorce? Are there any guarantees for the wife?
Well, first of all, if divorce takes place before consummation of marriage, the answer comes in the Quran, chapter 2, in verse 237. It says that if you divorce your wife before touching her, which is a symbol of marriage being consummated, then she would be entitled to 1/2 of the marital gift. So if the marital gift agreed to, for example, is, let's say, $5,000, she would be entitled to $2,500. unless of course she forgives, even though there was no consummation of marriage. It's a kind of consolation to her. If divorce takes place after marriage is consummated, then the wife would be entitled to a number of things. One, she would be entitled for the entire amount of marital gift, whether she has received part of it or didn't receive any part of it before. So whatever it was agreed, whether she has taken that in full or in part, she would be entitled to the full amount. Becomes due. Secondly, she would be entitled for all marital gifts or gifts that she was giving during the time of engagement or afterwards. She doesn't have to return anything. That's we're talking about gift that's given to her. Thirdly, she would be entitled for the full maintenance, housing, accommodation, clothing, medication, everything, during the waiting period, which we indicated is usually about 3 months, could extend to 9 months in case of pregnancy.
Yes.
That would be the full responsibility of the husband. Fourthly, if she happened to have a suckling baby, and they agree that she would suckle the baby, which of course is her right if they agree on some mutually fair conditions, she would be entitled for some fair payment for providing that service to her child, even though it's an instinctive thing. But again, since she's divorced, the husband would be responsible to provide for her so that she can keep in good health and look after the baby. Fifthly, if she has the custody of the baby or a small child, which is usually the case, she would be entitled also for child support, all the needs of the child. Sixthly, some jurists, but not all, believe also that she would be entitled for or entitled to some kind of divorce consolation gift, or mata', as the Quran mentioned it. It was mentioned, for example, in the Quran in chapter 2, in 2 verses, 236 and 241. Some interpret that verse in the Quran of providing some kind of consolation as desirable, highly laudable or encouraged. Others took it as a requirement. And some laws, even like I read, for example, the personal law in Syria, provide even for up to 1 year maintenance of a divorced wife, even after she has taken all the other financial privileges. As far as the final part was on the custody, right? The custody, the rule on custody in Islam basically is that the mother is more entitled to the custody of a small child. How small? There are differences of opinion on that. Some say, for example, up to the age of 7, the mother would be more entitled. Some jurists even say that in the case of a daughter, the mother is entitled to custody of the daughter until she becomes adolescent, and some even say until she gets married, because she needs guidance and education from her mother to prepare her, of course, for her future role as a wife and a mother. There are two basic conditions for this, however. First, that the mother should be fit. By fit, we're not only referring to physical fitness, fit both in terms of her mental capacity. For example, if the wife or the mother happen to have some mental disease that would endanger or affect the child, she does not get the custody. Fitness also could refer to good reputation. So a wife whose reputation is in question, or a divorcee, she would not be entitled automatically to the custody of the child, because again it might affect his or her moral upbringing. Yeah. A second major condition is that, according to one saying of the Prophet, peace be upon him, that she's entitled to the custody so long as she does not remarry. Because of course remarriage, whichever case, of course remarriage in any case endanger the interest of the child, but even in the case of a mother who's married to another man, the danger even might be greater. The man being a more dominating force in the household may not give sufficient care or good treatment to a child of another person. Of course it applies also to the other side, but in the case of a wife the danger might be greater even for the child. In fact, if I may add one quick comment here, because the question of custody is a very big field in Islamic law, that if you study Islamic law on the question of custody, you notice that there is more bias towards the female side, even though the responsibility for custody is both for husband and wife, but the bias is more towards the female side, and even female side from the wife's side before the custody passes on to another female side from the husband's family, or if no female is available, perhaps a male could also take custody of the child. The idea, of course, being that the female is assumed to have more compassion towards the child.
Well, we have to stop. That's our program for today. We've enjoyed doing this series. It was a long one, 46 programs. We want to invite you back next week when we'll start a new series. We'll be talking about the economic system of Islam. Thank you for watching. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be unto you.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar, Allah.